Hello! Welcome to another installment of Barry Hawkins Live with none other than your host, Barry Hawkins, which is me. Tonight, we continue making our way through effective development process at the team level. We've been making our way through the core artifacts, and tonight we come to the last of the core artifacts of effective team level development process, the development log, or as I usually abbreviate it after saying it 500 times, devlog. The development log is an artifact that accompanies and complements your task board, burn down chart, and your team's backlog, of course, being one of the other core artifacts, but especially within the mechanics and outcome of your development cycles or sprints. Development logs are an artifact that I started using. I created and started using and evolving over a decade ago, maybe even coming up on 14, 15 years now, because what I found was, while yes, the backlog helped us see our queue of work, the task board helped us have a highly visible and very effective plan and visualization of the work. The burn down chart helped us understand our trajectory as we were executing a development cycle day over day in terms of the rate at which taskable hours were being accomplished and gotten through. But there's more to the development cycle than just what you've planned in the sprint. And it was out of that need that I began using and evolving the development log. And the development log has 5 core pieces to it. It's a single page artifact. I most often will house development logs on a wiki, like a MediaWiki instance or Confluence. Other ones, any full-blown wiki is usually pretty great for this type of artifact. And with every development cycle, create a new development log. And on that log, you capture information about the cycle details, the backlog items that you've pulled into and are executing in your sprint, the non-backlog items or interrupt-driven items that are in your sprint, the team's availability, and then finally capturing retrospective notes. So let's look at and talk about what each of those sections look like and what they're meant to accomplish. I will be using an example that is from my Compendium, which is available online at barryhawkins.com. If you go there, the Compendium is linked in the top navigation, or barryhawkins.com/compendium/, and that'll get you there, and you can be on your way and exploring. But in there, I have an entry on the development logs. Now, one of the tough things about showing and talking about development logs is with clients or with the teams in the companies where I've been, in there full time, there's usually sensitive information in a development log, so I can't readily capture PDFs or screenshots of those. And so after having that excuse for not having images of them for years, I created a safe, fictitious one. Safe as in okay, not that other thing. So that's what we'll be using for our visual aid tonight. All right, so beginning with cycle details. Cycle details it's meant to be just a concise table that captures key information that identifies this development cycle and tells you a bit about its existence, when it starts and ends, and key aspects of metrics and effort. So you can see here in this fictitious example that's in the image, this team, whose name is the Shire 5 team, this is development cycle 4. If Scrum, they might say, Sprint 4, starting on February 13th, 2019, ending on February 26th, 2019. And at the start of the cycle, there are two core metrics. Throughput here is at 50 story points, and they're committed to completed, or to use the more contemporary term, projected to completed ratio is 1.5 as they enter this sprint. And as a reminder, throughput, or velocity, is a rolling average of the story points or level of effort completed by the team, the average over the last 6 development cycles or sprints. Projected to completed, or committed to completed, to use the older term, that is the ratio of how many story points were pulled into the cycle against how many points actually got completed. And so you can see here that currently they have been committing to a bit more with that ratio of 1.5 to 1. And this cycle, which had completed, they started with committing to 55 story points, and then at the end of the development cycle, ended up completing 47 out of those 55. So those are the cycle details. It's located at the top of a development log. When you start to have 5, 10, 15, 30, 60 teams, having this consistent format helps people, understand and visually parse and know which cycle you were talking about, and generally where were teams at in terms of, their metrics and effort. The next section is for backlog items, and I tell teams, so we call this backlog items, not meaning all right, any story or bug. It's backlog items because these are items that were entered into the backlog, that traveled through the backlog and were iterated upon in backlog maintenance, and then eventually in backlog grooming, so that they were refined, discussed by the whole team, estimated, approach talked about by the whole team, conditions of success refined together, all of those things. And then they were pulled into the cycle. Now, they might have been pulled in at the time of cycle planning or sprint planning, or they may have been pulled in through the course of the sprint. If the team was making progress and felt like they could do more, they may have pulled it in. There may have been one story or more that were pulled into the sprint that couldn't be executed on because they ran into delays or issues. And so those were pulled from the sprint, and then other items were pulled in to leverage the excess capacity. So you can see here, this team, the stories that they have in this sprint, the full range of sizes. You can see there's anywhere from a 2 story point to a 20. So they are, sitting in that range of, using the full range. I see a lot of teams these days that try to keep things at, 1, 2, 3, or 5, or 2, 3, or 5 story points. But it's actually okay to, use that first 2/3 of the scale on sprint-sized items. And so they managed to, complete all but the last thing. It looks, all of their preparation for where they were headed went well, and then it got time to take the old forest debris, and it seems like they ran into problems, possibly. So those are backlog items, and so you capture there the things that move through the backlog and were pulled into the cycle, and you also capture their state. When I have an item that's removed from a cycle, I will actually put a status of removed. I'll leave it in there and put removed, because that actually gives you that record and reminder of, hey, here's what happened in this development cycle. Some things came in, some things were removed, some things were completed, some things were carried over once we reached the end. Now, the next section is for non-backlog items, and this was one of the key things that led me to begin creating development logs, because what I found was when my teams and I were only looking at the sprint plan, we were really focused on, and we were only exposing and externalizing to the people who were, using the work that we were delivering, we were focusing on and only talking about our schedulable capacity. And we were never talking about, well, there are also always these interrupt-driven things. There's always some body of interrupt-driven work that hits us as a team. We own our own, services or sites, and so when they're down or they have a performance degradation issue, we're stopping schedulable work to get the service back up. And so having the non-backlog items there gives you a place to capture and chronicle those interrupt-driven things, and then cycle over cycle, as you look at your logs, you can come to see like what generally is the pattern of interrupt-driven work that we typically find ourselves servicing. And that's important to know, because if you're only ever talking about your schedulable capacity, your teams and your dependent teams and stakeholders can come to view your schedulable capacity as the only thing you're doing. And so sometimes you can, even if you have stable metrics, stable velocity, projected to completed ratio, you may hear folks think, well, they should be able to do more. It's just like when I look at the body of work, it seems like they should be delivering more. And that's because people don't understand, because it's not being exposed, that there's a ratio of schedulable to interrupt driven work that's normal for most any team. And having a sustainable balance of those two and ensuring that you don't overcommit to schedulable work is more readily accomplished when you have a concrete idea of the non-backlog items that tend to enter your cycles. So cycle details, backlog items, non-backlog items. Next, team availability. I've spoken before about how throughput or velocity being the rolling 6-cycle average of the effort a team completes. Velocity is a directional guide for how much work a team can pull into their development cycle. But at the time that you begin a development cycle, you actually have more detailed information. That is, who will be in the office for the whole development cycle. Who's going to be on PTO. If there are company holidays or national holidays, what have you. And so you can adjust your taskable hours, that is the amount of hours you have to task out work, to reflect that, so that you're not overcommitting. Because let's say this team has a velocity of 50 points, and coming into a development cycle, if they know that 2 or 3 people are going to be out for part of the cycle, if they were to plan against a full 50 points, they're very likely going to overcommit and carry over a bunch of work. So looking at your taskable hours and capturing it like this, it helps inform the commitment you make at the start of the cycle, but also it's a reminder for why this cycle may have had more throughput or less throughput. And that's another thing, especially when you're communicating to dependent teams and stakeholders and customers. Yes, if you know that our velocity is 50 and we only committed to 40 story points this time, that may seem like, well, what are they doing? But if you know, and if you're able to readily point to, well, our actual capacity, our actual scheduled capacity and taskable hours were lower because we had people out, then you can ensure that people aren't misinterpreting what actually was a proactive, normal, healthy development cycle. They're not misinterpreting that as significant undercommitment. Lastly, the dev log has a dedicated section for retrospective notes. Capturing notes about your retrospective is one of the most crucial things in my experience, to having retrospectives deliver on their intent, because the retrospective is meant to be that time when we inspect the cycle, how it went, how we work together, and we identify any possible need for adaptation and experimentation. Now, if that's all just a purely verbal conversation, that we're having with one another, and maybe someone's jotting some things down on paper. Maybe the team steward is jotting down some notes on paper or on their laptop. Well, we're at least capturing that, somewhere. But with the development log, capturing and journaling that here in this highly visible artifact helps you chronicle and journal, if you will, your team's progress and evolution cycle over cycle in becoming more effective at working together as a team. And I do generally have in the retrospective notes, I will start with a cycle overview where we just like high level recap. And then as the team is having a natural conversation about the cycle, and with the development log, because you have the backlog items and non-backlog items right above here and the team availability, you have a very handy snapshot right above where you're taking notes to reflect on and talk about the development cycle. And so then you can, in the course of that natural conversation, then the team steward is listening for what are things that people are saying are working well, and we want to ensure that we continue those practices and don't let that fall away. And also looking for things that could improve. And then as we capture those things that could improve, identifying possible experiments. And you can see here this team, they did identify 2 potential experiments for their next development cycle. The one proposal here, because their estimate of what it was going to take to travel through the old forest debris seemed to be massively off, they're proposing here trying to double our effort estimates for off-road travel. And they've identified this is the proposed experiment. Here's the evaluation criteria. Here's how we're going to evaluate it. And then this would be what we consider success criteria. So if we double our effort estimates for off-road travel, what we're going to evaluate is what's the difference between what we estimated and what it actually took. Because what we've learned about ourselves is we chronically underestimate how long travel is going to take. And then the success criteria, if the actual result is not more than twice the estimate, then great, we're getting better at estimating that particular kind of task or that particular kind of outcome. And then secondly here, avoid roads completely until Bree. That seems like a very specific experiment. And the evaluation criteria, do black riders find us? And the success criteria would be no. So that seems just insanely straightforward. And so those are development logs. Try it out. I do need to have, and I will link in the description for replay. I will share an example artifact. I have one up online, but currently there are some formatting issues, so I'll be working on that. All right. So let us look and see what questions await us today. All right. Do you get complaints from team stewards that this is time consuming? Yes, I do. But let me explain. I get complaints from team stewards who are not used to investing significant time in creating the kinds of artifacts that really raise the visibility and effectiveness of a team. So people who are used to the only artifacts they create are what pops out of whatever software they're using to track their project or their development cycles. And most of those artifacts, well, they're just there. If you put things in as you're told, then it'll spit that out. But those reports often are, they're actually the sort of thing that led me to create development logs. They focus solely on the schedulable work, the sprint plan. And as a result, when people try to use those to provide a more holistic picture, they usually do things like, well, let's put the interrupt driven work in the sprint because we need it to show up in the report. But they're actually putting interrupt driven work in, and it's being counted the same as their backlog work. So backlog and non-backlog are combined, and that actually artificially inflates their velocity. And so they create an expectation for themselves that they should be able to plan 70 story points of work in a development cycle, when actually 20 points of that is interrupt driven work that's not coming through the backlog at all. So try it out. Check out the development log entry in the compendium and see if you might find that it's more impactful, even if it does take you a bit more time to create than the vanilla artifacts that are generated by your software, or nothing, or using nothing at all. And then following on to that, why not just use a Jira Sprint Report? See previous question. All right. And it looks like, just check. Yes, no other questions today. So then we will call it a wrap. Thank you as always. This is now a reminder, this was the final entry on the artifacts of effective team level development process. We'll be picking up in our next installment on the two metrics, the only two metrics that I use in effective team level development process. If you're enjoying this series, please do like and subscribe, share with your friends, share on LinkedIn, because we'd love to have more folks participating and seeing if they get value out of this. So until the next episode, may you have the most effective development process and healthy teams you could possibly have. I'm Barry Hawkins, and we'll see you next time.